The first mistake most experienced men make is not weakness, it is speed. A woman pulls back slightly. Her texts shorten. She becomes less available. The warmth dips just enough for you to notice. And almost instantly, your mind translates that shift into a verdict: rejection. What is striking is how automatic this reflex is, especially in men who consider themselves emotionally seasoned. You have lived through divorce, betrayal, long marriages, breakups that blindsided you. You have learned that distance often precedes loss. So when you sense space, your nervous system does not analyze, it reacts. You were taught that attraction is demonstrated through consistency. If she likes you, she stays close. If she is interested, she increases contact. If she values you, she reassures you. That logic feels clean, predictable, safe. But adult attraction does not operate on a straight line. Women, especially emotionally aware women, regulate closeness differently than men expect. Sometimes they lean in, sometimes they recalibrate. That recalibration can look like withdrawal when it is simply pacing. Yet many men interpret any decrease in intensity as a decline in interest. Why? Because proximity feels like control. When she is engaged, responsive, available, you feel certain. Certainty feels powerful. When that certainty shifts, it exposes something uncomfortable. You are not in control of how she feels, you never were. So the mind tries to regain control by assigning meaning quickly. She is losing interest. I misread it. I am about to be replaced. This always happens. Notice how fast that escalates. It is rarely about this woman alone. It is about accumulated experience. It is about the time you did not see it coming. It is about the marriage that slowly cooled. It is about aging in a culture that subtly tells men their value declines unless they compensate with status or money. Distance touches those insecurities quietly. But here is the mature reframing. A shift in energy is information, not a verdict. A pause is not a conclusion. Attraction can breathe without dying. When you collapse space into rejection, you compress reality into a single interpretation. You remove nuance, you remove context, you remove her internal world entirely and replace it with your fear of loss. And that is where overreaction begins. Some men chase harder. They increase effort, increase contact, increase reassurance. Others withdraw preemptively to protect pride. Both responses come from the same reflex. If I move first, I control the outcome. But emotional steadiness requires tolerating ambiguity. If you can sit with the space without filling it with catastrophic meaning, something shifts internally. You stop personalizing normal fluctuations in adult connection. You start observing rather than reacting. That subtle difference changes the entire dynamic. One of the most counterintuitive truths about adult attraction is this: sometimes distance increases precisely because interest is real. Most men are conditioned to believe that desire expresses itself through escalation: more contact, more availability, more intensity. If it is genuine, it should expand in a straight line. That assumption feels logical because it mirrors how many men experience attraction. When you're interested, you lean in, you simplify, you pursue. But women often experience attraction with a parallel instinct that men underestimate. When something begins to matter, self-protection activates. A woman who feels nothing does not need to regulate anything. She can drift. She can be inconsistent without consequence. There is no emotional risk. But when she begins to feel attached, when she senses potential, the stakes change. Now she has something to lose, especially in midlife. A woman in her 40s or 50s is rarely experimenting blindly. She has been disappointed. She has invested in men who overpromised. She has likely learned that early intensity can disguise instability. So when chemistry appears, her instinct is not always to accelerate. It is often to slow down and assess. That assessment can look like distance. She may pull back slightly to evaluate her own feelings. She may reduce communication to see whether connection survives without constant stimulation. She may create space to ensure she is not being swept up by loneliness, projection, or timing. None of that equals rejection, it equals discernment. There is another layer men overlook. Attraction creates vulnerability. The more she feels, the more she risks being hurt. Regulating closeness gives her a sense of emotional control. It is not manipulation, it is calibration. You might interpret her shorter replies as fading interest. She might be consciously preventing herself from over-investing too quickly. You might assume decreased availability signals replacement. She might simply be protecting her independence. Consistency is not the same as desire. Sometimes steady intensity signals comfort, not passion. Sometimes measured pacing signals depth, not doubt. This is where male interpretation must evolve. If you assume that any fluctuation is loss of attraction, you force her to either reassure you or retreat further. But if you understand that pullback can be a sign that something meaningful is forming, you respond differently. You allow the dynamic to breathe. Attraction between mature adults is not a performance. It is a negotiation between desire and caution. Both exist at the same time. When you see her distance through that lens, you stop reacting to the surface and start considering the psychology underneath. And that shift moves the focus away from your fear and toward a clearer understanding of what may actually be happening. Here is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable but necessary. When she pulls back and you feel a surge of urgency, it is rarely about her alone. It is about memory. A man in his 40s, 50s, or 60s does not react from a blank slate. He reacts from accumulated history. A marriage that unraveled slowly. A partner who emotionally checked out long before she physically left. A betrayal that arrived without warning. Even smaller disappointments that stacked quietly over the years. Those experiences do not disappear. They compress into instinct. So when you sense distance, your body does not say, this is neutral. It says, this is familiar. And familiarity feels dangerous. This is the ego trap. Not ego in the loud, arrogant sense. Ego in the protective sense. The part of you that wants to avoid being blindsided again. The part that whispers, do not let this happen twice. The problem is that protection can distort perception. A slight change in tone becomes a pattern. A delayed reply becomes evidence. A rescheduled plan becomes a forecast of abandonment. You begin reacting to what might happen rather than what is actually happening. Layer aging into that dynamic, and the reaction intensifies. No matter how successful, fit, or accomplished you are aware of time. You know the dating market shifts. You know youth is prized loudly in culture, even if depth is valued quietly in real life. That awareness can make any sign of withdrawal feel like confirmation of a deeper fear. Maybe I am being replaced by someone newer. Maybe I am no longer as compelling as I once was. That is not weakness, that is human. But it becomes destructive when you treat those internal insecurities as objective truth. Pullback becomes proof of inadequacy. Instead of asking what this moment requires, you react to what your history is trying to avoid. You either over-pursue to reassert value, or you detach abruptly to protect pride. Both responses feel strong in the moment. Both are defensive. Mature discernment is different. Discernment observes patterns over time without panic. It notices sustained disinterest rather than momentary fluctuation. It asks whether her behavior aligns with her character, not whether it soothes your fear. It tolerates temporary ambiguity without collapsing into self-doubt. Defensive withdrawal, on the other hand, is pride disguised as strength. It says, if I step away first, I cannot be rejected. But that is still reaction. It is still governed by the fear of loss. The deeper work is internal posture. When you can recognize that her distance triggered an old wound rather than created a new one, something steadies. You stop outsourcing your sense of value to her current level of engagement. You begin responding from who you are now, not from who you were when you were hurt. And that steadiness quietly changes the entire frame of the interaction. When distance appears, most men feel an almost physical urge to close it. You tell yourself it is leadership. You call it effort. You frame it as showing interest. But if you are honest, much of that escalation is anxiety dressed up as initiative. Something feels uncertain, so you try to stabilize it through action. You text more, you suggest another plan quickly, you increase reassurance, you subtly try to pull her back toward the previous level of closeness. On the surface, it looks proactive. Underneath, it often communicates discomfort with ambiguity. Chasing is rarely about desire, it is about restoring control. The paradox is that this instinct, while understandable, often shifts the emotional balance in the wrong direction. When you accelerate, as she decelerates, the dynamic becomes uneven. She feels the pressure of your increased investment at the exact moment she is trying to regulate her own pace. That pressure does not create safety. It creates contraction. Calm steadiness does something different. When you do not chase, you are not withdrawing affection. You are maintaining proportion. If she pulls back slightly and you remain measured, the emotional field stabilizes. There is no sudden spike of need. There is no silent punishment. There is simply consistency. That consistency communicates something subtle but powerful. You are not threatened by space. For a woman, especially one who has experienced men becoming reactive, that steadiness is disarming. It signals that your interest is not fragile. It is not dependent on constant reassurance. It exists without demanding immediate reciprocation. Restraint, when it comes from security rather than strategy, shifts polarity naturally. She feels the room to move toward you rather than away from pressure. Curiosity grows in space, not in pursuit. This does not mean indifference, it means containment. There is a difference between pursuing from desire and pursuing from fear. The first feels grounded, the second feels urgent. Women sense that difference quickly, even if they cannot articulate it. When you hold your frame, you allow her behavior to reveal itself over time. If her pullback was simply pacing, she will re-engage without resistance. If it was genuine disinterest, that will become clear without you exhausting yourself trying to reverse it. Either outcome preserves your dignity. More importantly, it strengthens your internal authority. You stop scrambling for validation in micro moments. You trust that if attraction is real, it does not require constant management. And if it fades, no amount of chasing would have secured it anyway. The power shift is not about games, it is about emotional composure. When you are not shaken by temporary distance, you create a dynamic where connection is chosen, not coerced. That composure becomes less about influencing her behavior and more about defining your own standard. At some point, this stops being about her behavior and starts being about your identity. If a woman pulling back destabilizes you, the real issue is not attraction. It is attachment to outcome. It is the quiet belief that connection is scarce, that opportunities narrow with age, that you must secure this one before it disappears. Scarcity is subtle in midlife. It rarely sounds desperate. It sounds practical. You tell yourself the dating pool is smaller. You tell yourself time matters more now. You tell yourself you do not want to start over again. All of that may be partially true. But when those thoughts create urgency, they erode composure. Over-pursuit is often fear of running out. Mature masculinity operates from a different premise. It assumes that value is not a spike of chemistry, but a stable trait. It understands that attraction is not maintained through constant effort, but through emotional consistency. It recognizes that if you are grounded, connected to your own direction, and selective rather than reactive, you are not competing. You are choosing. When you internalize that, space stops feeling like danger. Pullback becomes data. It tells you about her pacing, her emotional availability, her level of investment. It does not immediately comment on your worth. You observe without collapsing into self-criticism or prideful withdrawal. That observation requires patience, not passive waiting, but active steadiness. You continue living your life. You remain engaged in your work, your health, your friendships. You do not freeze your world while waiting for her to recalibrate. That quiet independence is not a tactic, it is structure. Discernment grows from that structure. Instead of asking, how do I get her back to where we were? You begin asking, is this dynamic aligned with what I want long term? Does her rhythm fit mine? Does her communication style match the kind of connection I respect? You evaluate without hostility and without pleading. Self-trust becomes the anchor. You trust that if she leans back temporarily, you can tolerate it. You trust that if she disengages entirely, you will recover. You trust that your age is not a liability, but a filter. You have fewer illusions now. You see patterns faster. You waste less time. Relevance at 40, 50, or 60 is not about chasing youth or manufacturing intensity. It is about depth. Depth of character, depth of patience, depth of emotional regulation. The man who is not shaken by space is not detached. He is centered. He does not need constant affirmation to remain steady. He allows attraction to unfold at a sustainable pace, and in that steadiness, he becomes far more compelling than any man scrambling to close every gap.